All right, so it's going to be, I'm going to give you a little estimation game. We're going to talk about social contagion some more, and then I'll get on to voting and stories. So, but this is, well, let's see how we go. So, hopefully not too hard what we're doing here. And on Tuesday, I'll give you, results. All right. So, let's see. So, they're going to be a number of forms. I just want you to put your name here. Um, yeah, put your name, and then we're going to have your estimates down here in this first column. So I'll show you what we're doing. Okay, here's a picture of some things. Just take it in. This is I'm going to warm you up. We'll have an easy question to start with, which is so we have 5 questions, and then the winner is going to be the one who gets the closest percentage on average, and we may have to toggle this in interesting ways. So I need you to write this down. This is an independent thing. Don't talk to each other. You need to write these. You're going to write 5 numbers down. So that hopefully is not a hard one. This is not a place where being funny helps you because you will lose the, right? Once again, this is the picture with this is where we discover no one brings paper anymore to classes. Do you need paper? Who needs paper? Who needs? Is that all right?
I'm good.
Who else? Just rip it in half. Rip some paper in half. Who else needs paper? That's a pretty terrible thing I just did for you. But I just want you to write it down. You just, I know, sorry. It was terrible what I just did. No, this is not, you're not handing this in, so don't worry. Anyone need a pen? I think I have another pen. Nope, okay. All right, so how many bananas? Okay, so here's a visual for you. These are chocolate coated almonds, organic, very nice. Okay, so this is your visual, right? So, yeah, it's not grams. I just said not to give you grams. Sorry. If you want to put grams, you put grams. Okay, now we're going to be, yeah. I don't know why these, but yeah, right. Anyway, no, it's a good history. Okay, so, right, there you go. Next question is how many almonds in the bag? The bag is now hidden. So you got it. Just do the best you can, right? That's the game. Do the best you can. Fourth question is what's the bulk item number for xanthan gum at City Market? Again, do the best you can. No talking. You just write down what you think it is. And what's the volume of Neptune in cubic parsecs? So I really hope you get this one. We're really solid here, right? Yeah. It will hurt you terribly if you get that off by, if you put a 0 for bananas, then, well, maybe that's what you think, and we have a different neurological thing to talk about. But that would harm your average, shall we say? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get numbers down for them, and then I'll pass around a piece of paper, and you can enter them as I talk about some other things. So like when you buy them, right? Like this, you write the number on it so they know which one it is. Yeah. I'm sure it's like in some food co-op thing. I'm sure they have.
We do have. It's just you don't have like
a bulk, like
yeah.
nombre de bulk. No, I'm sure there's some. It's not a particularly clever. It's not like some Greek roots. It's just sticking. Yeah.
My vocabulary is restricted inside academia.
Oh, I see. I see. That's safe. Yeah. Okay. So you have that. You have your numbers written down. Just do the best you can. All right. Well, as you go through them, then you're going to fill out. There's one for each one. The first, it says at the top like bananas or whatever. So There are 5 pages, which is going to seem like a lot, but let's do that. And once it's gone around to the back, just tell me and I'll pick them up. All right.
I hope I won't.
Estimation. So on Tuesday, we'll have a little feedback on that. So I wanted to flash through the rest of this social contagion stuff, and then I'll talk about voting, and we'll see how far I can get with these things today. A lot of this is just.
We should have randomized because now everyone will take my number as the.
No, you're not allowed to, you can't, whatever you've written down is what you've written down. You're not allowed to change it based on, yeah. So, yes? No, we're okay? No, so that was a good point to bring up. This is your independent evaluations. This is not a game thing where you're trying to, scoop someone by being just underneath them, whatever it is, Price is Right or something. All right. And if you're allergic to almonds, I'll keep them hermetically sealed, and we can find a charity for them or something. Anyway, so this is work by Duncan. My old colleague. So we're gonna mention this quickly because it was a big change from the mean field model of Granovetter, which was just where you know what everyone else is doing. Okay, you have an estimation problem to do, so I'll show that quickly for you. And it's going to be a snap thing. Do you have a piece of paper to write on? There you go. It doesn't have to be. There are 5 things to estimate, and they are here. Oh, well, I'll show you. So you need to see this one picture. Here's a picture. First question is how many bananas are in the picture? Okay. And then you should observe this object from a distance. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I just want to give it, yeah. All right. It's chocolate coated almonds. So you have to estimate how much it weighs, how many are in the bag. And so this is an independent thing. You're doing the best you can, and we're trying it, right? Then there's what's the bulk item number of xanthan gum at City Market. You do the best you can. And then what's the volume of Neptune in cubic parsecs? To the nearest order of magnitude, shall we say. Someone's going to give it 6 significant digits, which I think is fantastic. Well, maybe not now I've said it. Okay, and then there's a piece of paper being passed around, and you can fill out the various things. Okay, so I guess when it gets to the back, please bring it back around to Catherine. All right, good. So really, that's it. Like there's no other usefulness there. Okay, we'll see what happens. All right, so now we're going to put this this simple threshold model on a network, and it's just going to be a random network, and we'll get lots of different behaviors. There's lots of other stuff. I'm not going to talk about these, but there are lots of other. I'll touch on these. What I'm going to do is just flash through them today. Yeah, beautiful work by James Gleeson, who's in Limerick in Ireland, I think he is right now, and just fantastic work over the years. Okay, so how do things spread on networks? All right, so I'll give you a few little pictures. As I said, I'm just going to flash through all of this. So the game now is you have a threshold of, in this just little example, of a fifth, right? So 0.2. So at least 1 in 5 of your friends does something, you adopt that behavior. Very simple little switch on mechanism. So in this case, A has adopted something because there was some influence over here, has 4, these arrows are showing the direction of influence, but it's a mutual interaction, right? So 1 out of 5, so A switched on it, sort of T equals 1. So at the next time step, E realizes, that one of their 3 friends is doing this thing, and this is 3 friends with respect to some thing they're interested in, right? It might not be all of their friends at all, but it's about, do you, have an iPhone? Do you, whatever it is, right? Do you have a TikTok account? Maybe you really only care about 7 people with respect to that kind of thing. So this is some subset of a real social network. And then, so they switch on, C would have switched on because 1 out of 5. And then in this next step, B now has, 1, 2 out of 8 of their friends. So that's a quarter which exceeds 0.2, so they switch on, and then it potentially keeps going. So very different to the simplest disease spreading model, the SIR type model, which is this independent interaction, and the memory is lost, you're bumping into people. Now it's anchored into a network. So this is, usually in physics, the more I mean, anything, I suppose, but just in physics, the more you the ridiculous term is quench, like you make it more structured and fixed, you should see different behaviors. So the network's sparse. That's just true of many complex networks, right? So that's a fair thing. Nodes have these contacts. We're going to see that each one weighs the same amount. And the variation we'll have is we'll have a network, and then it will actually be interesting enough for everyone to have the same threshold, right? So you can then spread the threshold out and have a distribution for that. For the Granovetter model, where it was random interactions, so there was no interaction structure, right? It's structureless, it's random. The material, the stuff that went in was the distribution of thresholds, right? That you have different kinds of individuals, the gullible ones and then the ones that didn't switch on. So now you can have everyone be the same. It's just that they have a different number of friends that they look at. So it's a good thing to play around with. And of course, then you could then mess around with the thresholds as well. There's so much work here. We'll make it synchronous, so everyone kind of updates which you could say is a bit strange, but you can imagine, like going to a protest. Like, do you go out the next day to a protest, right? I mean, and we talked about the fall of Eastern Europe, Black Lives Matter protests in the last year. I mean, these can be deeply perilous contexts to put yourself into every day, right? So, how do you make sure enough people turn up if you're trying to organize it? How do you yourself decide whether you will go? Robi Muhammad, who did the Small World work with us at Columbia, he's Indonesian, and when he was at undergrad, there were a lot of student protests, and he had a story where student organizing things came around and had a list, right? And you put your name on it, and you would come to this protest the next day, and it was sort of being organized. But it was this influence thing of like seeing many names on the list. So he gets to the next day, and there's like 10 of them, right? Like it just wasn't, it was very much not what he thought was going to go on. And, there were military with guns. It was a very dangerous kind of situation, right? So these are, so what I'm sort of saying here is that, this is sort of a plausible thing for some kinds of real phenomena, but of course it's probably going to be asynchronous in many. And there's basically just, the number of active friends on divided by the number of total friends that you're thinking about, or, people that you're, receiving information from. They don't have to be friends, but we'll just sort of say that it's greater than some threshold, then you activate. And you stay on, right? So it's a susceptible, infected thing. Yeah. So these are big problems, right? So if one individual switches on, what's the probability that it all takes, that there's spreading? So it's a cascade condition. And there are two parts to that. Can spreading occur? And if so, what's the probability, right? So it's a phase transition kind of thing. And then, we'll come back to this, but what sort of features of a network determine whether this is doable for small random ones, but gets increasingly harder as we start to look at more and more realistic or take realistic networks. This is basically the story for these kinds of, there's a network structure under here, but really we're not going to do any of the math for this, maybe next semester, but what turns out, the sort of discovery is that there can be networks where there's kind of a critical mass here, and there are different types, but basically there's a critical mass. So it's still a network, but anyone in this center, if they're switched on, it will spread through there because they're all, and the word is vulnerable, right? They're all prone to adopting a behavior if just one of their friends switches on. So that for random networks, that becomes the key thing. If one of your friends does something, then you adopt, right? Which might to you seem kind of weird because you've got lots of friends. You're not just going to turn on because of one person. But maybe now with this particular kind of influence, and it could be anything from again fashion to something more extreme. Like you're only paying attention to like 4 or 5 people, right? So that can be a little more fragile. But what that's also saying is you're drawing back from, instead of having an average of what everyone is doing, you're only now watching what a couple of people do, and in a sense you've created an ignorant structure, right? You've really limited the information that people have about their world, which is also just sort of true of kind of how we can function. Of course, you can look at Twitter and watch CNN or something. Like you can get tons of news about stuff now. It's a different game, right? That's what messes with all of these things now. But that's the idea. Is there's potentially there's this small, large. It's actually still from a macroscopic point of view, you can see it. If you think about infinite network, but all of these characters in here, they have such weak networks, and their thresholds are such that if one of their friends turns on, they will turn on. So anyone who's connected into that, someone who's got a friend in this group, if they switch on, they will turn this on. Spreads through here. Then this is what you would call the critical mass. Then there's a sort of a triggering component, right? So any of these in the critical mass, all this component outside can switch, make this little part of this tinderbox burn. Then once it takes off, potentially you have nodes out here that need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of their friends to turn on, right? So they're not vulnerables anymore. Like you're not just going to switch on because one person did, but if 2 do, now you're like, okay, I'm doing it.
Could you explain how that leftmost node that's in the triggering component isn't in the Omega final?
Yeah, so you could have someone out here who has 1,000 friends, and they will never switch on in this thing because maybe eventually it's still possible, right? That they're sort of way off by the edge. So they have friends in here. So if they switch on, they go, but they're really resistant to any kind of yeah. So it's a very good question. So this is sort of a possible thing. So well spotted, and it's drawn in that way to say that, but it could be that, and this is the overall network, right? So these are resilient characters out here, but this shape here could be the whole thing, and it would envelop this as well. Yeah. Good. So look, there's some beautiful math. There's all this sort of stuff we can do with this, but this is a big story, and it's it shows this kind of very brittle possibility for a system. Eventually, and I kind of have it a bit later, but show that this is just for random networks. But what we really do have in the real world, of course, is group-based structures, and you can have peripheral kinds of networks where people are poorly connected, right, or maybe a little more vulnerable to this thing, and it can spread through them and eventually start to get these really well-connected people. But it can be on the edges, and we've seen it with COVID globally. It's country scales. Like Singapore had this sort of thing emerge where maybe 20% of the population is immigrant workers, and they live very close together. It's a terrible sort of situation. But and Singapore is very kind of well controlled. But you've created structures that can allow for spreading, and that's of course disease. But yeah, the sort of homophily or how well connected people are together, can make a particular story or disease, really spread through a pocket, and then that starts to make everything else vulnerable. With Omicron, for example, the story seems to be we don't like if you look at it, you don't really know what there's no sort of adjacent genomic thing, right? Like it's just sort of popped, and they're like, okay, so the possibility is that it's been in a place where we had no surveillance, or maybe in a very small pocket of people for some reason, or one person where it's been kind of developing, and then sort of popped out. But it's probably because we didn't see it. But you've got a connected group. So this is just another example. Like if you want to sort of keep the world safe, then you have to look after the least, right? I mean, I think that's in some of these religions. All right, so we'll follow active links. I don't want to show you all this stuff. I just want to kind of, because we're running out of time. But here's this really big deal in random networks and just sort of networks in general. So if you right, so we've got some network and we're going to randomly choose. This is a really profound big deal. We're going to randomly choose a node, right? And so let's say it has some distribution piece of k, right? So probably it has degree k. And if you've done networks, you will have seen this. But it's really profound thing. Okay, so then we change the problem, and we'll say, well, what if we jump on a link? And this is a thing I just want to communicate. Like most stuff that you do with network modeling in theory, but thinking in general, you need to think from the edges first. Don't. It's easy, again, it's sort of a story thing. We'll think about the nodes because we can imagine being that person, but you want to think about this. So when you think of someone's got COVID over there, you want to be actually thinking of the vectors coming out of them. That is, and mathematically, most stuff actually works like this too, right? So if an edge is infected, how many new edges of infection does it beget? Rather than if someone's sick, how many more people do they get sick? You want to think about this edge coming out of them, connecting to this person, and this one connects to this person. How many more outgoing edges will be potentially infected? So this is a different problem now. Like what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, let's just choose an edge randomly, and then we'll go in one of the directions. We'll just flip a coin and go. So we travel along here. What's the probability that this node has degree k? That's a different question. So we're sampling first by node, right? Choosing nodes. Now we're going to choose edges first, run along in one direction, and then say what's the probability that, ask this question, what's the probability that it has degree k? And so there are k ways to reach a degree k node, right? It has k paths going into it. So you get this amplification like this, and we'll call it qk, and then you have to normalize it. This is a normalization. This is actually, if you look at this, this is actually the average degree on the bottom, so it's often just left like that. But what's happening here is there's a k here times pk, that gives you the problem. So if you go to an edge first and then randomly run along, I had this in the random network stuff, which we didn't talk about this semester, but if you randomly run along to the nearest node, again, randomly choosing a direction, then it's not peak, right? It's a different probability. It's amplified, right? So this is an amplifier. And if we go back to the rich get richer model, Simon's model, this is Simon's model, basically. Rich get richer structure is built in. It's built in. It's a linear thing. So this is like, this is to connect back to this thing I talked about too much probably, but this is, this is rich get richer. So that's the normalization, and this is the piece, right? So the scribblings is supposed to give you this slide. So what this means is there's this sort of built-in issue when you're kind of traveling around a network that you're going to tend to hit nodes that have higher degrees than is sort of otherwise in the background, right? PK is the underlying degree distribution. The ones you hit as you travel around are going to have this higher degree, right? Because there are more ways to get to them. And this leads to a lot of things. If you look at this and think about what's the average degree of your friends, it's higher than you. So the only way it's the same is when everyone has the same degree. If there's some variation in degree, the average person's friends will have more friends than them. So this is a very disappointing feature of networks, which we live in. And there are a whole bunch of other related kind of measurements that seem to kind of follow from that, basically because you're in networks. One is, for example, like on Google Scholar, you can see that on average, an author's colleagues will have more citations than them. Right? There's just kind of everything goes wrong as soon as there's a network structure. So the keeping up with the Joneses thing is built in because on average your friends are better than you. Hopefully they have more diseases and committed more crimes or whatever, but they're different to you because you're sampling from them by edges, right? Then you're not choosing a random person. You're choosing people by edges. So it's an interesting mechanic, but when it comes to contagion, it's incredibly problematic. Okay, so this is sort of this overall thing that we can kind of write down, like what's the gain factor, and this is, and I like to write it like this. You won't see this in other places. Generally not. This is the probability that if you run along an edge, you hit a degree K node. This is the probability that we'll sort of allow this. The probability that node has flips, right, gets infected. So that's sort of that's a disease-based thing. This is network, this is disease-based, and this is how many outgoing edges it has, right? So if you hit a degree K node, you infect it, then there are K-1 new ones. If you hit a degree K node and you do not affect it, then there are 0 outgoing infected edges, right? So this part goes away. So this is like success and failure. And then this becomes the expected number of newly infected edges that an infected edge gives in a basic kind of random network story. And you can read it off. There's a physical sort of story to this, right? Probability of hitting a node of degree k, probably that degree k node gets infected from this one edge of infection, and that's how many new edges come out. So if this thing is greater than 1, then we have things can take off. You can seed it, nothing takes off. You can seed it here, nothing takes off. But on average, you expect it to grow. It's a simple kind of model. It's still random networks. There's no structure in it. All right. So that becomes the basic contagion condition. All right. And you can collapse things nicely, right? So if you say everything, it doesn't matter how many friends you have just have a probability of switching on. That's some fraction between 0 and 1. Then that beta kind of pops out. You just have this condition. But to find giant components, to sort of go back to a graph theory thing, you just say, okay, everyone gets infected, and this becomes the condition that there's a giant component in the network, which obviously has to exist for any spreading to occur at all. All right, so let me get to this point, and I'll try to explain it. This was the surprising result of going from where everyone's looking at everyone and bumping into each other and putting on a network. I mean, it's a huge change, right? Now you're only connected to, on average, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a small number. These are just simple random networks. So it's a vastly different situation from knowing on average what everyone else is doing. Now you only know about this small group of people around you, and it is a random network story, right? So this Z, this is average degree. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this curve here is the fraction of vulnerables, right? So that's that little critical mass thing that was in the middle of that picture before with the match inside it. So what's going on as you increase the degree? So why is it kind of going up and down? Well, what's happening is everyone in this case has, I think in this case it's like 0.18 or something. So basically, they all have the same threshold. There's a random network. So what's variable is how many friends you have. There's some average that everyone has, but there's some variation, right? So if your average, number of friends is 1.5, there'll be some that have 0 friends, some have 1, some have 2, some have 3, right? And of course, you have 0 friends, you can't spread anything. If you have 1 friend, then you're a dead end. If you have 2, then you can get infected and pass it on. But and of course, because we're talking about networks, there's sort of just these discrete changes. That is not enough, right? That's not enough for something to take off. It's like not expanding. But if you have 2 other friends, so degree 3 nodes, they become really important, right? 4, 5, 6. All right, so these are the examples of the giant component of these networks, right? It's a total hairball out here. It's pretty well connected by even, an average degree of 4, right? So I only have an average degree of 4, but renders like this. And this is the point where, and I know this is not in this particular course, but as I've rendered it this time, but average degree of 1 is when we start to get a giant component, right? So that there's it's connected. So this is like the percolation threshold, right? So we did percolation threshold. Okay, so this is the largest component back here. It's like just 4 nodes connected together. It's quite thin, so it's going to be mostly points. So yeah, obviously for anything to spread, you have to be in this category. So that's why, right? There's just vulnerables. There are vulnerables. There are nodes that have 1 friend or whatever, but they're not connected to each other. So the largest component of vulnerables is tiny. So it starts to get connected enough, and you start to get these things, these things, these things. But what happens is the fraction of vulnerables starts to go down because eventually, if you've got 20 friends or 10 friends, you're not a vulnerable anymore, right? Because if you have one of your 10 friends turns on or one of your 20 friends turns off, that's not going to be, it's not going to exceed 0.2. So the vulnerables for this kind of setup are only nodes that have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 friends. If you have 6 friends, suddenly now you need 2 people to do something before you'll adopt it. Right? You have an extra, you're aware of more in the world. If someone says this thing, you need someone else to say it before you'll switch. So even though everything's becoming more and more connected, that largest component of vulnerables is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it actually vanishes eventually. Because now eventually out here, everyone's got enough friends, right? They're starting to see a lot more. Out here is 20, 100, whatever. One of your friends turning on, everyone has a threshold of 0.2, won't change anything. So you get these two phase transitions. One is just simply structural, like nothing can spread until you have, a substrate. Here it's really connected, and if you were doing disease spreading, things would just go straight through this, right? This is a hugely connected network. It would just spread through it. But the threshold model does this strange thing where eventually there's no little core of vulnerables that makes a critical mass kind of thing. So there's no spreading out here. But just before that, when it takes off, it goes through that little critical mass, but then starts to get nodes that take 2 friends or 3 friends or 4 friends or 5 friends, and eventually actually spreads to the whole thing. So this is an incredibly perilous looking thing. It looks like most people are taking in enough information to kind of, not be swayed by just one friend doing something, right? They're less gullible here. But if it does take off, it will spread to the whole thing. So eventually, even the most resilient will switch on. This is a particular model. It's random networks. Everyone has the same threshold. But this is a pretty, again, one of these kind of shocking transitions. It's not like as you go below here, the final cascade size is small. It's everyone. So this, you'd think you have a system here that's robust. It's fine. But if you just start to limit people's knowledge of their world a little bit more, suddenly you have this. Okay, do we have all the forms, by the way? Yeah, so let's pass this back. Yep. Yep. Thank you. And then if you could give it to me once. 1, 2. So I do want you to, yeah, make sure fill it out. Yeah, you just add to this. There's one for each thing. And it should say,
Oh, I see. I saw it.
it says there, yeah, what it is. And then let me know. Okay, I mean, this was a sort of a big result early on in networks to show that, of course, simple disease spreading on networks is a big deal. We can study that for a while. This was something looking at social phenomena that really gave us a different story again. So I just want to say, yeah, just that this edge here, what's happening as you drop down here, you start to get nodes that need, on average here it's 6, here it's 5, right? So they're starting to, you get some nodes as you shift that average. There's going to be some that went from 5 to 4 or 6 to 5. So they become vulnerable, and there's this tiny, right here, there's this tiny little nucleus of connected vulnerables. If anything starts in there or adjacent to it, it spreads through it, eventually it cascades out. Nodes that take 2 hits, 3 hits, 4 hits, 5 hits, they all become infected, and you get everyone's infected. So this is a shocking transition. Yes.
So I'm wondering, in the last few years, there's been a lot of work around multi-layer networks.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering what you think about all that, because I guess that most of the results are for like a single layer network, right? Where we just like consider one type of edges.
Yeah.
What happens does that like qualitatively change?
Yeah. I mean, the small world stuff we did was that, right? It was a multi-layered thing. So it can change it profoundly. And a lot of them, it's where there's essentially like, the connections are just random compared to the other one, right? You got a network here, you got another network here, and then the nodes are just permuted through them. So it can open up just enormously.
Like too complex, many complexities for us to.
Well, I mean, well, I think I think you got to do it. I mean, because I mean, it was really critical to work we did years ago, so I'm totally on board with it. It's just, it's starting to get at that edge, and I'll show you some of those if I can, like where you add enough, you're trying to make it a little more real, and you kind of run out of where you can do things analytically.
True. Yeah.
Right. So what happens is you have theoretical math people, like they will go more, or theoretical physicists will go further over here and do only stay with things that are analytically solvable, and that's like it is beautiful space to be in. But you get into this sort of perilous thing where you like add more features, can't really do it. It's a sort of simulation, and then you start to move towards sort of agent-based models where you have 10 parameters or something, and that's
Because
you lose the ability to understand what's really happening.
my feeling is that like a lot of networks I'm working with, I always end up with parables, right? So I need to find a ways to kind of simplify and or like finding backbones or
Yeah.
looking at the different layers. And but you need the data for that. But that's always what happens when I work with networks. That's like,
Look, I think it's the responsible thing to do. You just have to like get some real data at this point, and like there's a limit to how much you can do with this stuff. And these are really important results, but they're bedrock things that you understand. The analytic stuff works. It's not too hard, like you can tell the story. Um, but when you have a page of stuff that came out of Mathematica and you're like, this is the contagion condition, it's like, I don't really, that doesn't help at all. Like it doesn't, like there's no, well, you can do it, but I mean, does it aid intuition? Can you then sort of think about it? Because,
I mean, those who can do something with it's usually not the social scientists, right?
right.
That will be people coming from like physics or engineering.
Yeah, but I sort of doubt the use of some of that there too, right? Because okay, so, all right, so, okay, so now the game is, so there's a second column here. So I want you to I want you to look at what other people wrote, and I want you collectively to get it right. Right, so the second one is like, can you as a team get it right? So now you can do whatever you want. Well, just look at what other people have done, and yeah. You still have to make your own decision. So if you think, it's too high, you could goose it by putting an average that's lower or something like that. All right, let's do this. Let's do it. Okay, let's take that one away. Yeah. I just want to make sure that you guys. Yeah. Okay. Good.
You get the net cubic parsecs.
Oh yeah. I kind of took over the second column in my first answer.
Well, you can fix it up. Okay. Right, but now the idea is like based on what other people have said, right? Just scan through it, see if you can put in a. You get to make your own decision still, right? Don't take too long. Don't worry. Don't worry.
I'll just take the average.
All right. I think that's enough of. I mean, look at this wildly insane. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I want to touch on a few other pieces in these slides. I'll just touch on a few other pieces in this slide. So there's a final. So the problem was, what's the final size? That was not understood. This original paper by Duncan. There was no. Of course, we want to know about that, right? I mean, this is this great question of like, how big will the thing be? So this was work by Gleason and Carlane, just really nice stuff. I mean, I made this little thing to try to explain it, but the difficult thing is usually with the mathematical techniques around random networks is you avoid the connected stuff. You actually do everything about all the little isolated pieces and then say, okay, 1 minus all of that is what's happening in the giant component. So it seemed like a place you couldn't be in because it had loops and cycles. It's a bit of a more complicated thing to work with. The outside stuff is all pure branching, and that math, we're happy with the math there. You can do all this generating function stuff and whatever. But anyway, it turned out that you don't need to do that, and this was this nice work. It's like, we'll think about what is the chance that a node eventually switches on at time t, and the way to think about that is to think about the branching network that's coming out from it. These are random networks, so there's no cycling structures in them. So again, that's a huge advantage. But this is sort of what would happen, right? Active at time, when you see the color codes, like this one eventually is going to switch on at time 4, because finally, out of its, what is it? I think it's 10 friends, 4 of them have switched on, and it's a threshold of a third, right? So finally it gets there, so switch on. So you can write down the mathematics for this. and actually get the complete time series, like how the spreading will happen. Like what's the, not just the final size, but the size at time t, which is pretty impressive. So this is beautiful work. I'll just kind of give you a couple more pieces about it. I mean, there's no way I can talk about it, but so whether something takes off is all about this picture, and whether something gets infected in the long run is all about this picture, right? So, does a seed take off? And then the opposite story is, if you're just a node in here, what's the chances that enough of your friends turn on? And then you have to think about, well, what's the chance they turned on, or they turned on, and they turned on? So you get these iterative maps that kind of draw in towards you. And this will depend on how many friends you have, how many other friends they have, how many, right? So there's this nice probabilistic stuff to play around with. And the same game goes here. But it's really, again, about the edges. You sort of stick this person on at the end, but you think about the edges coming out of them. How many edges do they beget? How many edges? And then you stick on how many friends they have. Same game here, right? Edges getting edges, and eventually you sort of stick it to someone in the middle. Anyway, it's nice. Expansion and contraction. And these are very general kinds of things. But I'm not going to show you. But this is the hilariousness of it. It looks probably terrible, but there's some fraction of nodes that turn on at the start. That's what this is, and this is a sort of iterative map of whether you have other edges coming in being infected or not. There are all these permutations for how that can happen. You see this structure appearing again, right? This is this rich get richer piece built in, right? So instead of PK, it's got a KPK. This is about the node itself, so we don't have to worry about it. This is the edges getting in. So that's it. Probably that an edge at time t+1 is infected is related to, probably the edges coming into a node are infected at time t. Anyway, we're not going to worry about it. It was really, really lovely work. So this is Gleason and Carlin. And then you can basically make an iterative map, and we like these iterative maps. That this is some number between 0 and 1, some number between 0 and 1. There's some seed fraction that are infected, and we can. We don't need to do that. Okay, I'm not gonna. There's too much. This is just to give you a sense of, on these networks, like how things. If you look at the successful spreading, how does it work, right? So at time t = 0, if we look at all the cascades that have taken off, which nodes were infected at time t = 0, and then which ones were infected at t = 1. And it's going to have this kind of form because this is a thing where you need at least one. It's a fifth is the threshold. So what's happening is very few are going to get. There could be some weird network structures, but no one's going to get infected at the next time step because there's only one person who's turned on. So, you have to have that one person being connected to you, and you have to have less than 5 other friends. So what happens is disproportionately successful ones, it's going to be the most influential vulnerables. This is a sort of a thing to think about. Ones that are vulnerable, but can convey as much infection to others, right? So again, so this is sort of about early adopters, right? Let's find, this is a big deal. Let's find the influentials, let's find the early adopters, let's mess with them. But at least in these kinds of systems, what you see is, early on, it's going to be the ones that take one hit, but it's going to be disproportionately the ones that have the most friends. So that's going to be the degree 5 nodes. And there's going to be degree sort of 10 or 11 nodes that'll start to pick up, right? It's going to be the distribution is pushed this way a little bit. All of these ones take 2 hits to turn on, but the ones that really spread it more are going to be the ones with the most other friends if they need 2 hits. And that keeps going. All right. Yeah, so just, this is my most cited paper. This is just one other piece here. This is trying to understand what happens with, there's some degree distribution again. We're thinking about these threshold models. What happens if you seed it from an average individual or you seed it from a really well-connected individual? So it's kind of obvious that, right, you want to start with the most connected person. And that makes sense for disease spreading, but simple social contagion doesn't necessarily work like that. And you see this kind of story where, what's the gain in paying for someone who's more influential or whatever to influential to be the seed for this thing. And you see this sort of cascade size ratio, right? So the more connected ones do sort of make for a bigger kind of spread, but only at these kind of edges of this cascade window where it's really kind of a strange business. But the gain is actually generally less than one. It's only here. So if you double the number of friends that the initial person has, you don't double the final size, right? You generally speaking in these models less than that. There are some other examples of this. It's the same kind of story. Of course, these were just random networks, so you can start to create networks that have different structures in them, right? So there's, random networks never have any structured stuff, but as soon as you do that, you get very different behaviors. And if you add groups, I know I've got this. If you add groups, you've seen I've had these kinds of things. Here's one where we've got a random network. We put groups in instead of nodes and then randomly connect them. So it kind of gives us, there are interconnections here. So there's group structure in here, and then there's some sort of across group structure as well. So we've got some parameters to play around with. The stuff we use for small worlds, right, which is all of this business where we kind of create hierarchical things and then make these multi-layered networks. And then, we added connections to sort of fill in those groups. There's all sorts of stuff in there. This is going to be perhaps hard to see, but that upshot of this is a sort of normal cascade window for random networks. But as soon as you start to, there's one across here is one of these random group networks. This is generalized affiliation model. So these are both kind of networks that have group structure. This is where we have an individual seed. This is where we put in, say, 10 random nodes. And this is where we seed 10 random nodes, but in a group. And this dark color here is indicating the final size. And what's happening is this is an average degree of the network. So in the normal random network, this is the only place you get spreading. Now we're starting to see it creep out, and creep out. And the story here is, if you seed a group in these networks, you can make gigantic spreading happen. And it should make sense that that's possible. But it has a lot of implications, and of course for good and bad, right? So you want to spread something that's good or bad, you definitely try to get a group on board with it if you have a group-based world, and we do have group-based worlds. So this is sort of a remarkable opening up of stuff. There's another piece in here. This was an odd result where this is the average cascade size, and this is the degree distribution for the initially infected node, right? So this is something where you see that in fact the largest cascade size comes from poorly connected nodes, being the first one. So someone out here who's got a connected, average degree of 20, it does get some sort of final size, right? This is 0 to 0.8, but it's actually in here. And what's happening, this is like the Singapore story, is that these poorly connected nodes are connected to each other, right? So this is an assortative network. So you have these groups of people who are connected to each other. In this case, it's degrees, so they're similar in degree. The well-connected nodes tend to be connected to other well-connected nodes, which makes them resilient, right? So for this kind of threshold model. So if all of your friends have 20 friends as well, and you start to wear Ugg boots or something, they're not going to switch on. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, by the way. You finally got Blundstones, so that was right. No one wears Ugg boots outside in Australia. Like, it's an inside thing. Okay, well, it depends. It's a classic. Okay, so, and I speak that coming from very low. Anyway, so, but all of your friends, have 20 friends. They're not gonna, you start doing the thing. They're not gonna do it because their threshold's not exceeded. But if you're in a group where you have 4 friends and they have 4, all your friends only have 4 friends, then you're in this sort of vulnerable group, and it can spread through your group, and then someone who's connected to that group but has 2 friends in it can switch on. So this is a real departure from disease kinds of things, and it points to a much more dangerous sort of like situation where seeding in small places, seemingly innocuous, poorly connected parts of a network, can lead to overall disaster. And certainly, the propaganda efforts over years that we understand, I think we understand now, like Russia in the 80s trying to seed the idea that, this is what I understand, seed the idea that AIDS was developed in a CIA lab in the US or something, and then, spread to the rest of the world. It's still, I think that conspiracy theory still floats around. Um, but they did that by publishing this, getting the story published in like English speaking, but very distal newspapers, like in India, Thailand. There's very sort of off to the edge ones, not the major papers in those places. And it just sort of eventually kind of crept in this kind of way. And then Dan Rather on CBS started talking about it, which is very, very impressive. And of course, and I remember an uncle of mine was worked for Exxon his whole life, and was head of eventually head of like the South Korea, right? Like he was head of that part. And I should have consulted with him on this, but I remember I showed him that figure I showed you with that kind of closing in around someone, and this was the consulting work had come to him because they're trying to influence the energy minister in South Korea, right? And so they draw a social network around them, a social network around them, a social network, and you start to like talk to the people out here, and work your way in. And it's totally right. And I remember I showed him that figure I just showed you, the little, and he's like, yes. And I'm like, why do I have no money? But anyway, so obviously this can be used for good and bad, right? Yes. And it depends how well organized you are with these things. But yeah, that kind of creeping in through systems. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Seemingly independently. Yes, really crucial. Yes. Well, it just means that once, and it's this picture here. Once this person starts to eventually potentially can see it, or this whatever it is, it seems like it's going to be from independent pieces. Advertisers try to do this. Johan Uganda, I don't have it in my notes, but had a great work years ago with John Kleinberg looking at people joining, again, sort of benign, but joining Facebook, right? So it's just whether they join Facebook in the front end. And if the people, because Facebook knows all these things, right? So if the people on Facebook that you were in contact with, I guess they knew through an email or something, were more diverse, there was more likelihood that you would join. So if it's just you're from this one group of people, they're all on it, that matters. But if you've got then, like this is your church group, this is your basketball group, this is your high school group or something, so they're able to show exactly that kind of, and they did it's beautiful work actually, yeah. Anyway, so it's interesting for me, I don't know everything about how the world runs, of course, but just to sort of see that large corporations, know about this. Of course, governments know about this. Advertisers are trying to do this all the time. They're trying to make you think that it's coming from different directions. And of course, things sometimes genuinely do, right? They do. And that is, good things spread like this and sort of bad things. But I think that's sort of a PSA thing that I've had in my head for years, is basically, do you know who your friends have been copying? Right? We have the good ones about, like who have they been licking or whatever, right? That kind of stuff. I know I'm trying to use the disgusting things, but like for diseases or whatever, or just, like, and we have it like, if your best friend jumped off a cliff, would you do it? I mean, there's sort of the same terrible thing that parents would say to their children. It was sort of codified as a apparently useful bit of cultural, knowledge. So we're sort of aware of it, right? But it is hard when you really think that this person over here and this person, and this news thing, you really think of them as, it's hard for you to see them as being correlated, that they're independent. That's a pretty tough kind of influence. I mean, like, how could it not be true? So, yeah, but if you, I mean, we're limited organisms, right? So if you can seed it in these very different places, oh, I mean, my God, yeah. right? So it's very different to the idea. Like, let's just go and attack this person and like, try to or whatever, or just try to influence them directly, blah blah blah. No, it's much more sneaky. Okay. Anyway, this is without anymore. Okay, so but it's a lot of benign people are really people who aren't with conspiracy theories and so on. A lot of these people aren't marching around and doing things actively. There's a lot of fairly lightweight kind of echoing or passive like moving on of stuff. But it all adds up, and at least in these models, these influential vulnerables, which is sort of this oxymoron, right? They're people who are susceptible but also have some influence. So it's sort of the balance of those two things. They're the ones that are the real conduit for spread, right? So they're easy to flip, but they also have the most friends, right? Uh, and as soon as you start putting in groups, and this is to your the point of the complexity of reality, right? Is, we added these group things, and I've just thrown it at you, but these were very hard models to build and mess around with. We couldn't do anything analytically, so it's simulations. But they at least showed us like, oh, it's wildly different. Like now it's like much more dangerous. Like the spread is just, where we thought it was limited before, now you can do, now things can really take off. Um, and all of this says, it's really individuals obviously matter, they're all part of it, but the cascade condition is something about the system as a whole, right? It's like, will this message spread? Well, you sort of just need to know about the whole network, right? And that's a very hard thing to yeah. Yeah, and then, because this is the mistake we'll make, right? Who started the spread, right? We afterwards we'll say they were influential in making this thing take off, but there's a huge network structure that's being missed. Yeah, I mean, this is how to do it. Create things to be transmitted. I mean, this is how to become famous, right? Right, and you want things to spread in the social wild, what I call the social wild, right? And then this is just sort of a claim. I mean, you have to keep those things pretty simple, right? So the ideas that spread really broadly and fastly have to be simple. This is why memes do well, jokes. I mean, traditionally sort of do well, right? They're lightweight little things that are funny. People enjoy receiving them and they want to spread them, right? They want to pass them on. There are things that you might enjoy but you don't want to spread. We have data on that. I mean, not us, but you've sort of there's been analyses, for example, in the New York Times. There's the stuff that's most emailed and the stuff that's most read, and it's not the same list, right? I think they say most emailed, most shared, I suppose they say now. But what is the stuff that people pass on to others, right? And it's probably it's a lot more relaxed. It's stuff about like health and puppies and funny things and whatever, right? It's going to be a little more relaxed. Some serious things, but things maybe that might be informative to people in terms of their health. But stuff about war, people read it. They just don't really spread it as much because it's it doesn't get them a lot of social kudos to like spread this. Hey, terrible thing. Here's a terrible thing. And you need to have this, of course, in your messages, right? That individuals will want to display it. They will want to talk about it. They will want to whatever it is. So fashion works because you have it on you, right? So I voted badge, right? That's an important little thing because otherwise you wouldn't know. All of the ribbons, which are just a colossal number of colors that I don't know what the taxonomy of those things are anymore, but that worked well. But right, so anyway, yeah. So these are passive or active. Hats, red hats, right, with a little thing on them. That's pretty great. It's like boom, that makes it really simple to see someone is on a team. And of course, sports teams too. Anyway, so and there's of course how these entities fight with each other potentially, whether they knock each other out. So it's always this kind of effort to do that. Okay. This is an older one. I'll just share this. This is a little visualization from a while ago. There's a clock ticking there. But this is I think it's Barbados just left the Commonwealth. right? Yeah. Australia hanging in there. England will cease to exist before Australia leaves, apparently. So, this clock is too slow.
We should have that for languages, programming languages. That would be great. I want to see MATLAB.
Python is like,
Yeah, but MATLAB being huge and then packages.
oh yeah, sort of growth, but then it has its splinter
So fun.
anaconda or something, right? There's like this. If you do it like that, you'd have your little.
Yes,
I mean, just like religions, right? You got to have your splinter groups.
it's the hardest part, I think, when you deal
Yeah.
with this kind of.
Linux,
Yeah,
Linux, like you know.
but yeah.
Yeah, no, you can totally right. Yeah. England, what a ridiculous place. Okay, so it's just ridiculous. Uh, so the Philippines. I mean, Puerto Rico, which is confusing for Americans, right? But it's also American. 20th century. All right. Nothing happened for the first 20 years. Nothing. Nothing happened. So Egypt's ejected. See, Canada changed the flag. That was really a good move. It was huge. No, it's huge. It's a fantastic flag. Yeah. There you go. Right. Of course, Quebec has tried to make its own little bud, right? I mean, yeah. When was the last time? 1990.
The last referendum, 95.
Yeah.
51.
So it kind of went a bit like this, but stayed.
Yeah.
So there was a payoff, right?
Where's Amazon and Google?
True. So you can do it for companies, right? Because the mergers and acquisitions are.
Well, I would argue that they could be the same. In the
Oh, they're no, sure. Yeah, the entities. Yeah. Vanuatu says it's time to go. Who's going to be the last to leave? Any? So 1999 is what? Who leaves in? I mean, I know we still got. There's Hong Kong. Yeah. There's Macau has escaped from.
That French Guiana's still hanging on.
Is that it? I think that's it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, we've tried to get data on like just the changing. I know this is a different thing, but the changing borders of, I mean, just countries existing, right? Like the English running around saying, by the way, this is a country now. Um, there's that, but there's also just Europe's borders changing. There's sort of visualizations of it, but I don't think the data is very good. There's still parts of the world where the borders are just like dashes, like Afghanistan and China, and like it's just they just turn into dashes because it's sort of like, well, maybe. Okay. Okay. That was enjoyable. Okay, I'm going to introduce this a little bit. Yeah, talk for 10 minutes about this. Okay, so I'll put these things out of order a little bit. So this is, well, whatever. There's no order. There's this little section I have on stories, which feeds into the next course as well. But oh yeah, this is my. So I'm making these slides. What a helpful. He is what?
No.
He is helping. Oh yeah. It's amazing. It's an unbelievable cat. Anyway, there's a lot of of appearing for needs. Oh yeah, the John Dory, right? This is the rhyming slang for story. Um, so well, at the end of this, we'll talk a little bit about emotional arcs, but it's sort of just a start at trying to understand stories from a bigger picture. And I have a ridiculous word for measuring stories from a distance, which is which is like far knowledge, telegnomics. Yeah. Anyway, it's in the title of the paper, so whatever. And the other word from this year is ousiometrics, which is the measurement of the essence of things, right? So, what are the fundamental dimensions of meaning, and that's in the next semester. So that's yeah, I think it's a huge deal. All right, and it will feed into this. Anyway, so I think I can give you a couple, like some nice, like a little bit of motivation for thinking about story. So it's one of these things where people are like, well, yes, of course, obviously, blah, 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 or why would you do this? And there's lots of different reactions. And I will say with working in social phenomena for, over 20 years now, I think we started to understand early on, like, if you start to get people saying that is totally obvious, and then another set of people saying this is completely wrong, you're probably in a good space, right? You wasn't probably in a good space. So we kind of confront that a fair amount. But anyway, I think we've prevailed fair enough. This is Ed Yong, who of course was conscripted into by himself, but writing about pandemics for COVID for several years and doing fantastic work there. But it's from a few years, it's not that long ago. So it's a hunter-gatherer group in the Philippines, so ethnographic study. And so storytelling in this group is valued above everything else, right? Including hunting, right? And sort of the story we might tell about hunter-gatherers, right? The hunters are the important ones. And the stories, as you might imagine, right? It's an oral tradition, about lots of stories, but many of them encode, survival stories, right? There are pro-social kind of norms built into them, or ways of behaving, right? Algorithms, and I'll go wildly out of control and sort of liken stories to algorithms and all sorts of things. So there's that, and then the stories, of course, get refined and reproduced over time, right, and carried through. That's the cultural part. But the storytellers have the most children as well. So that was an extra detail. So it's not just the stories reproducing, but the best storytellers, the golden tons, seem to have more children than other people. So, it's the super survival of stories, if you like. And that image is taken from that article. So lots of things tell stories, right? When it comes down to it, the news is like the stories of right now. I mean, right? There's all the world of books and all these. So art is a strange space of stories. In some ways, you can break stories in sort of from a very distant. There's character and sort of flat things like that, and then the actual dynamics of what happens. Character can change. So art, a piece of art is sitting in front of you, and you can add the story to it, but you can. All of these things, HBO. I mean, these are all storytelling outfits. These are, the structures that got built on top of social networks that do lots of things, but they help people spread stories. Sport, I'm going to say sport is storytelling, and it's a special kind of sport, because it's spontaneous. There are rules, the kind of things that can happen, but there are, depending on the sport, there are sort of these different possibilities, and it can be, always sort of exciting and interesting, and there can be twists and turns, and we love to talk about like the big comeback. There's sort of these sort of ways of talking about sports that have, story type, revenge, all these things. Video games, that people will go against that perhaps as to whether they have stories in them, but I mean, obviously many explicitly do, right? They're just built around story pieces. How successful they are. Religions absolutely run on stories, sermons and so on. They're like stories, often stories about individuals, which is something we talked about the other day. Any countries have stories, the and they range, of course, from the very simple to very complex. And religions tend to have some pretty good chiseled down simple stories to tell you, right? And then maybe the more complicated stuff can come later from Deuteronomy or whatever it is. Got to save that up. The U.S. can be boiled down to rags to riches, right? That's a big arc story for that's the American dream, right? That's the understanding of the story that's possible here. Whether it's possible is one question, right? That's by itself, like whether it's possible. And I should show you the visualization. And then there's also whether people believe it, right? So could be possible, people might not believe it. It could be not possible, but people believe it, which is probably the case a little bit more than people think. Anyway, but people are kind of running around. So the way to sort of shortcut stories too, though, is to kind of just go to character, right? Just go to character, right? So Hillary Clinton is a witch, and that's it, right? And then the stories that get told about her, if you think that are believable, right? Then they're all possible. But there's just a flat characterization that gets connected to stories. So this is work by Cesar Hidalgo, who's done a lot of interesting things. He's now in Europe. He came up with this. It's a simple idea. It's a measure of fame, and we'll talk about fame next week. But the idea was to go to Wikipedia and figure out how many different languages any person was talked about it. It has a piece in it, an article about them. So, Aristotle is written up, in all of these different languages. The Beatles, many, many languages. Tom Brady, maybe not so many. And that was just a simple measure of who's famous. And so this is Japan over 100 years. This is kind of a breakdown of who's famous from Japan, right? Given again this like how much they talked about globally. So this is like people exports in terms of fame. And so you can see a lot of these are about, right? These are what I would call story, right? These are all stories. Politicians are in an important story space. The scientists are here with the inability to tell stories, so they matter tremendously. Kind of again, this is more character based, right? The stories come out of whatever's going on, but this really dominated by this, and I think this is kind of the case. And if you look at, say, this is the U.S. actors, number one, storytelling. And can I do this in a right? That's what I want to do. So the rankings, by the way, Bill Gates. Yeah, I don't know if it's still alive, but that was the pantheon.media.mit.edu. Yeah. Right, so it's a mixture of some politicians in here. Richard Stallman, wow. Emacs, that's wildly ridiculous. So it sort of tells you about Wikipedia. Robin Williams, Steven Seagal, who I think is very popular in Eastern Europe. Anyway, so celebrities who are up here, right? There's Paris Hilton, Kim Kardashian, Monica Lewinsky, right? These are different reasons. Presenters, Jon Stewart, Colbert, models. What else have we got in here? Mafia. There you go. That's good. Extremists, Jeffrey Dahmer, McVeigh. I mean, who are companion. Wow. Damn, that's awful. Magicians. This is getting really. I don't think I have one for clowns, but that would be dangerous. Pornography. And then comic artists, right? Matt Groening. I mean, these are all, celebrities are a little more flat character things that are connecting to story, like I could be like them or whatever, or you can follow them. Game designers, Will Wright is, right? Didn't he do SimCity? Is that SimCity? Anyway, all right. Okay, but this is then this good place to stop. I know it's time to stop, but let me just sort of give you this. This is for the world, and this is to give you a sense. This is for different periods, right? Up until recently here, contracting in time. So politicians, this is of course from now, sort of are the ones that sort of stand, leaders of countries and so on, religious figures. These dominate. The politicians become smaller and smaller and smaller over time. Soccer dominates the world, and I fit this into stories. But these are all athletic, right? Basketball players here, cyclists, which seems a bit excessive. But actors and singers, right, really start to dominate. This is pornography. Okay, that's great. But it's that kind of rise of stories, right? So writers, and certainly if you look through here, writers and so on. And just to give a sense of this again, like, so there are writers, because to write, right, you just need a piece of paper, blah, blah, blah. You can be Jane Austen sitting in a little chair. But then you start to get movies, then you have movie directors become famous, and then the sort of most, I think at this point, the most sort of highest level, requiring the most complexity of a society is a video game director, right? Like, and again, to think of them as telling stories, because you just need a colossal number of people to be involved with that. All right, so this is the arc of stories becoming more and more, or the people who tell stories becoming more and more dominant. All right, we'll talk more on Tuesday. Thank you.